Hello, my name is Nikhil, and today I'll be talking about the trials of Gabriel Fernandez, the docu series. The overall plot of the docu series is an 8-year-old boy died of horrific abuse, and his parents are on trial. His mother and her boyfriend are the ones who have inflicted such abuse on him. This death could have been avoided because there were failures of child protective services agencies who were involved, who they could have said something, but they were not. Many of these agents were fired, and there were many warning signs as a, that people ignored. For example, there's one instance where Gabriel came to school with bruises on his arms, and he asked a teacher if it was okay for him to be beaten because he was quote unquote gay. The mother and her boyfriend were charged with torture and murder, first degree murder. Both of them pled guilty to the charges, and the two of them were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. There were many ethical questions that are involved in the abuse in abuse. For one, the protection of children and getting them away from abusive parents is an ethical issue, but you don't want to rock the family boat. Like Gabriel's uncles and grandparents tried to speak up and tried to get him away from their parents, but due to how custody laws work, they couldn't. They had to tread carefully. And just another thing is just speaking up against abuse is another ethical complaint involved. Like, and witnesses just need to speak up in general. One reason why they do not speak up is because most of them fear reprisal. Because oftentimes you have someone who they threaten reprisals against people who speak up. And also, you don't want to rock the family boat, like I mentioned earlier. There are custody laws are one of the ways that that Gabriel could have been saved. Now, custody laws vary on state to state. In the United States, it's a state affair. Some states, the parents have sole jurisdiction, while in other cases, the uh, the grandparents and uncle get a say in the jurisdiction in the custody. But like I said, it varies from state to state. Gabriel's uncle and various family members try to stop his mom and her boyfriend from abusing him that much, but they haven't. But they couldn't do much. They weren't believed. And healing and restoration is a massive part of how do you heal a person who has been abused. Abuse people who suffer from abuse suffer from PTSD. As a result of this, cannot they oftentimes suffer from nightmares of what happened. And the scars of the abuse and the wounds are still there. And how do you restore the relationship of a parent and their child in a case of abuse like this? It's hard, but eventually both sides are going to have to reckon with the abuse that was inflicted, both the parent and the child. There are a ton of biblical stories in the Bible about abuse. One of them, for example, was a case of rape. Tamar and Amnon were both half siblings, and Amnon raped his stepsister Tamar, and no one really helped her. Basically, this is a classic story of rape. A guy looks at a girl he likes, but once, then he sexually assaults her and just throws her away, treats her like dirt. It's pretty much what happened to Tamar. And actually, Ammon's sexual assault against Tamar would eventually lead to Absalom, Tamar's sister, trying to overthrow David. So it had a major, it was a major event in David's life. Another case of abuse in the Bible was children used as human sacrifices. When Israel was being unfaithful to God and broke their covenant, they would turn to worship idols. And many of these pagan beliefs placed a huge emphasis on human sacrifice. And one of these religions would place an emphasis on sacrificing children, that the Israeli people was one of their favorite pagan religions to go to. And eventually, everyone knows about the story of David and Bathsheba. And it's considered a classical story of adultery. But what is not known is it could also be argued to be a case of abuse because it was, if you, on the surface, it could be considered sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, as oftentimes like a person in power would often offer sex in exchange for favors. David was the king, but and he had a position of power over Bathsheba, and due to him being the king, he can do whatever he wants in the land of Israel, and no one can tell him no. Bathsheba was not in a position to tell David no when he wanted to sleep with her, basically. But ultimately, despite all this, I tell these stories because to tell people that God cares about you. If you have been abused, God cares about you. He wouldn't have put many of these stories in there had he not cared about you, where they can relate. These stories can relate, can be used to relate to people. The Bible may be a 2,000-year-old book, but a lot of the stories in it can relate to people to this day. And the God of the universe does care about you. I also had some personal experience in my family about abuse. The example pretty much was my uncle. He was adopted, but he grew up in an abusive home. His mother left his father for another man, and there was a ton of verbal abuse and physical abuse that his stepfather gave to him. Like, one incident was when the stepfather took a trash can full of stuff and dumped the contents on his bed. His mother did nothing because she was in love with the man, and in fact, she blamed my uncle for the reason their marriage went south, pretty much. He was eventually adopted by my grandma and grandpa, and he was given a safe place to live. He was best friends with my dad, so it wasn't that much of a issue for him. But yeah, his siblings and nephews love him unconditionally. I'm one of them, and he considers grandpa his dad. During the funeral we had for my grandpa 2 years ago, my uncle went up to the stand and he said, "My father died in 2009. My stepfather died in 2014, and my dad died in 2021. The scars of abuse that he suffered as a teenager are still there to this day. Here are my sources.